Application Life Cycle Risk Management Podcast, Episode 19. It's called Unit Testing for a reason. One of the problems I had when I started to learn unit testing, and a concept that seems to be hard to grasp as I teach others about unit testing, is this concept of testing just a unit. What is a unit, after all? Simply put, a unit is one feature or functionality that your application needs to perform. The problem I see most people have is not that they don't know how to test a unit, so much as they don't understand what a feature or a function is. This is best illustrated by a recent testing problem. The feature that was being introduced was a classic role-based security issue with a twist. A user could be one of 3 different roles, but the record they're trying to view could also be part of 3 separate roles. You can look at a record based on the interaction of the 2. So, how would we test this? More accurately, how would you design this so that you could test it? If you think of the problem as, can we log in, you will be tempted to test this as one unit. But you actually have at least 3 units to this problem. What role is the logged in user? What role is the record you're trying to view? And given a particular user role and a particular record role, can the user view the record? If we have 3 user roles and 3 record roles, this means that we will need 3 tests for each of the user and record role functions, and 9 tests for the can a user see a record. To be able to test this properly, we will also need to ensure we have 3 separate methods and possibly 3 separate classes in our system. Now, why is testing units so difficult to understand? Now that we've broken out the problem, we will probably still run into trouble when we start to create tests for this, because if you're like most of the programmers I know, you'll make at least one of these methods call down to your data access layer in order to figure out what role who is in. Now, I understand why you might do this. Most of our code looks something like the view calls the business rules calls the data. The problem with this way of thinking about your code is that you will always have dependencies on other code further down the chain, making the code nearly impossible to unit test. What you will need to do instead is to think about how you will test this code as you are coding. You heard me say it before, but this is one of the benefits of unit testing. It makes you think about the design from 2 different perspectives, which ultimately makes your code more solid and more flexible. So one way you might go about separating your code from the data is by using dependency injection. What I'm talking about here is simple injection, no frameworks. So let's say you have a class you may have called user role. Given a user ID, it will return a role. How could we code this so that it doesn't matter where the code comes from? By declaring an interface to a user role object, maybe, and then passing an object of that type to the constructor. By doing this, you can use a fake object when you're testing and a real object when you're using the system in production. But your code won't really care which one is being used. At some point, we will need to retrieve data, but the data isn't always just a side effect. If you have a way of getting at the data, and you're confident that it works because that standard mechanism has been tested, then you don't need to write test for the data access piece. You only need to write test for, given I have good data, this method will do this. Maybe you've noticed tools that will look at your class and create unit tests for each of the public methods. Maybe you think, cool, I'll get one of those and it will tell me what to write. But if you don't understand what you're testing, these tools can leave quite a bit out of the picture. For example, if you have a method that you need to test that has 2 parameters and depends on a property being set, you have all of the tests that you need to write to make sure it does what it's supposed to do. But you also have several tests that you need to write when bad parameters get passed in. Test that a tool can't stub out for you because it doesn't know anything other than that you have a method with 2 parameters. This isn't to say that test generation tools aren't helpful, but as with most tools, they only become helpful once you understand how to test by hand.